Hello, and welcome to the Her Head in Films podcast. I'm your host. My name is Caitlin. In this podcast, I share my personal musings on cinema. If you're new to the podcast, you might be wondering who I am. As I said, my name is Caitlin. I'm a writer. I'm a dreamer. I have a mad, passionate love for cinema, especially art house cinema and world cinema. I love literature. I love art. I'm someone who's very curious about the world, and I love learning. I love soaking up knowledge, and but one of my big passions is film, and so that's why I created this podcast. I live in a rural area in the South in the United States, and I don't have an art house cinema where I live. I barely have a bookstore, so I don't live in a place where I really have anyone to talk to about films and literature. And I do have a book podcast, which I have a link to it in the description of this episode, and you can follow that if it interests you. But so this podcast is really an outlet for me to share my thoughts and feelings about films that I watch. And so the title, if you're wondering, it comes from an email that I sent a friend a few years ago. I was sort of obsessed with films at the time, which I usually am. And I wrote in that email that my head isn't in the clouds, my head is in films. And so it was a phrase that really stuck with me and that came back to me when I started thinking about doing this podcast. And so I thought that Her Head in Films was a really great descriptor for the way that films sort of invade my brain, and they're all that I can think about sometimes. And I'm pretty much a self-taught cinephile. I don't have any kind of specialization in film. I don't have any kind of, special knowledge, or I'm not an academic. I have a degree, a Bachelor of Arts degree in literature and in women's and gender studies. I don't have any kind of, special degree or anything in cinema. Didn't take any film classes. So I'm pretty much someone who is learning as I go. I'm self-taught in many ways, and I'm learning just through watching things and watching different directors and different films. And so that's sort of been my education, is just experiencing films and watching them. And so yeah, this podcast is more about the personal. There are really great podcasts out there that will go into more depth about the history of cinema and different things like that. I don't really offer that. I just offer a podcast about films filtered through my personal lens and how I feel and what I think. So that's the introduction. That's what I would like to tell you. And today I'm just going to go ahead and dive right in to what I want to talk about, which is two films about Jean-Dominique Bauby, and I'm also going to talk about Bauby's memoir. So the two films, I have my notes out. Yeah, and I just want to dig right in. Sometimes I'll talk about more general things at the beginning of the podcast, but I have so much that I want to say about these films that I really just want to just dig right in. So the first film that I'm going to talk about is called Locked-In Syndrome. It's directed by Jean-Jacques Beineix, and it came out in 1997. And then the second film I'm going to talk about is called The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, and it's by Julian Schnabel, and it came out in 2007. And I will talk a little bit about Bauby's memoir, The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. So these two films were made 10 years apart, and they are about the same man, Jean-Dominique Bauby. He was an editor at Elle Magazine in France. In 1995, when he was 43 years old, He suffered a devastating stroke, and he was plunged into what is commonly known as locked-in syndrome. It's a very rare condition of complete paralysis. It paralyzes the body, but unlike maybe other conditions, it does not harm the brain. Some people who have strokes, will go into a vegetative state, and the brain is pretty much gone. But with locked-in syndrome, the person is paralyzed, but they're still conscious, they're still able to think, they just can't really communicate or move. And that's why it's called locked-in syndrome. Bauby died 2 years later, 2 years after suffering his stroke. He died in 1997, and he died shortly after his memoir, The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, was published. So we have 2 films that were made about Bauby. And Bauby's story is very unique. It's very interesting. It's, you don't come across stories like this every day. And so his story has really made an impact on me. And that's why I wanted to talk about these films and about his memoir, because it's just been with me for so long. I mean, for a decade now. Ever since I saw The Diving Bell and the Butterfly in probably 2007. So I think his story is worth talking about, and I think it's worth delving into the cinematic depictions of his condition and of, illness and disability and things like that. So I'm going to talk about locked-in syndrome, which I was fortunate to watch a few days ago. And it's by Jean-Jacques Beineix, and it came out in 1997. So this documentary is interesting. It takes us into the hospital where Bauby lives after his stroke. It's a hospital that is situated by the sea in France. I think it's called Berck-sur-Mer, and it's a hospital where people with strokes and other paralysis and other physical issues go. At that hospital, Bauby is taken care of by various nurses. He has speech therapy. I should have mentioned this earlier. The way that Bauby wrote his memoir was, even though his whole body was paralyzed, the only thing he was still able to move was his left eyelid. And so he had a woman, her name was Claude, and I think she was with a publishing house, and she came in, and every day she would sit with him and she would go through the alphabet, and when he wanted a particular word, he would blink his left eyelid, and then she would transcribe it. And in that way, that's how they wrote The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. So it was this very painstaking process, but it was able to be written. What's interesting is that Beineix is known as an important director of cinéma de look, and that was an audacious and colorful, though short-lived movement in French cinema in the 1980s. Luc Besson was part of it, and so was Beineix and some other French directors. He made films like Diva, which I haven't seen yet, but I want to see, and Betty Blue, which I have seen, which is a good film. And so he made these very colorful, vibrant films in the 1980s, but with this film in particular, in the 1990s, he started to go more into documentary in the 90s, and I would say this film, Locked-in Syndrome, is much more somber, much more solemn in many ways, and you really would not think that it's by the same director who did Betty Blue, for instance. But the documentary, it does have a whimsical quality about it, even maybe an impressionistic quality. In the way that Beineix films the hallways of the hospital at night when they're empty, or when he shows a little girl playing with a wind-up toy, or he shows Bauby's daughter, I think it's Bauby's daughter, it's a little girl anyways, doing cartwheels on the beach as he looks on in his wheelchair. Bauby had 2 children. He had a daughter and he had a son. And so I think that's her on the beach. But so this documentary it's very somber in some ways. It shows Bauby in his hospital bed. It shows him in his wheelchair when he's sort of sitting by the sea. But then it has these more playful moments, as I said, like, or I guess more poetic moments, and like the wind-up toy and the little girl doing cartwheels on the beach, and so there's a lightness to it as well, and it also shows Claude with Bauby and how she would say the alphabet, and he would blink his eye, and he would communicate in that way. And so you sort of see the process of how the book is written, and then there are passages from the book that are quoted, like the beginning, and so it's a very straightforward film. There's not a lot of bells and whistles. It's pretty straightforward and to the point as a documentary, I think. But it's always very interesting to see the real subject, which is Bauby. And I had actually not seen this film before. I'd seen The Diving Bell and the Butterfly about 10 years ago. And so it was actually very interesting if you're someone who's read the memoir, or if you've seen The Diving Bell and the Butterfly by Julian Schnabel, then to see Locked-In Syndrome is actually really interesting, because you're seeing Bauby with your own eyes, and you're seeing the environment in which he lived. And it's a film that focuses solely on his life at that moment in the hospital. It doesn't really go beyond that. It doesn't talk about his life before, or show many of the people that were in his life before. So as a document of Bauby's experience and his time in Berk-sur-Mer, it's very valuable, I think, and it shows him in the flesh and what he looked like and what his environment looked like, and so I think it's really valuable in that way as a document, of his life at that time. And so I'm really glad I watched it, because Bauby is someone who has interested me for years now, and his story is just so compelling, because of the Locked-In Syndrome, because he could only communicate through his left eyelid, and to see him actually doing that is very interesting. It's one thing to read the memoir. It's one thing to see a film, a cinematic representation of what he did, but it's sort of a different thing to actually see him really doing that, and blinking his eye, and attempting to communicate with the world. And it's actually very moving to see him, and so I'm glad I watched the documentary. It's about 27 minutes, so it's a short documentary, but I think it's packed with a lot of important information. And so because I watched the Beineix film, I decided that I really wanted to revisit The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. And it's actually interesting that I did it this year, because if you think about it, with Bauby having died in 1997, this year, 2017, marks 20 years since his passing. And 20 years since his death. So it's actually sort of fitting to revisit the diving bell and the butterfly for that reason. I mean, I wasn't consciously aware of that, but it's actually pretty fitting that I did revisit it. So I went back and I watched The Diving Bell and the Butterfly tonight, and it stars Matthew Amalric. I wish I was better at pronouncing things. I mean, I went and looked at an interview of him pronouncing it, and I was like, I'm gonna do this. And then I get here doing the podcast, and I get nervous. Matthew Amalric. And it was directed by Julian Schnabel. And it's on Netflix. I mean, I'm in the United States, and it's on Netflix in the US right now. And so if you are interested in the film, you can watch it on Netflix. So this film it's one of those films that sort of, I don't want to say it's like a defining film in my life, but it's an impactful film, and it's an important film. I mean, I still remember seeing it, and it stayed with me for years, and it got me interested in Bauby, and it inspired me to read Bauby's memoir, which is really good, and I might talk a little bit about it. So I want to say, I'm pretty sure that I saw this film in the theater, and it came out in 2007, right? So I was 18. I was about 17 or 18 years old. And where I used to live, I don't live there anymore. There used to be this movie theater that was nearby, and it was really cheap. It was like $1 or $2 to get in. And they would show foreign films sometimes. I got really lucky for a while, and they showed all kinds of foreign films at that movie theater. I got to see Pan's Labyrinth. I got to see The Lives of Others, and I'm pretty sure I got to see The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. I want to say that I did see it at that theater, and I might have to ask my mom, because we used to go together to the movies. She didn't care for the foreign films, so I kind of had to drag her to them, and she'd like fall asleep or whatever, but I still got to see my foreign films, which I love. So the theater, it was cheap because they didn't get the new releases. They didn't get a film like the week that it was released or the week that it came out. They would get the film several months later, and so I think that's why they were able to be so cheap. And of course, concessions were still expensive and stuff, but I mean, it was pretty rare to have a movie theater where you could get in for a couple of dollars, and so I was really lucky to have that for a certain period of time, and they showed foreign films for a little while, and then eventually they basically stopped, and they were really only showing like the blockbusters. It was really sort of devastating, but for a little while I was really lucky to have that experience, and I really do cherish it. So this film for me it's tied to a lot of good memories and difficult memories, because in 2007 that would have been a year after my father's death. My father died in 2006, and that was a really devastating experience, as I've talked about on this podcast a lot. I do tend to talk about it a lot because I was 16 when it happened, and it was catastrophic, and it was very painful, and a lot of what I go through even now, 11 years later, is tied to his death. The anxiety, the depression I deal with, the chronic pain, the things that I endure have a lot to do with my father's death, because it was so damaging to me, and it was just so, it shattered me. And so after his death, my mom and I, we sort of turned to movies for comfort. And so, like I said, we would go to that cheap movie theater, and I would see foreign films, and I'd also see like maybe comedies and stuff like that. It wasn't always foreign films, but we saw a lot of movies together, and cinema was sort of, it was a comfort through that grief. And maybe I'll try to talk about that more in future podcasts or something. So this film, I watch it, like a year after my father's death. So it's a film about mortality. It's a film about the body's degradation, and it's so much about human vulnerability and human fragility, but it's also about cherishing life, appreciating life. So there's a lot of themes in it that were very, I think, resonant for me at that time in my life, and I think they still resonate in many ways. So this film is intertwined with very specific memories for me, and it does hold a great deal of meaning for me because of that. It's tied to this time and place in my life that were very intense. I mean, even now I can sort of feel myself back in that darkened theater, and I can feel the effect that film had on me. And I mean, that's sort of interesting about movies, and songs tend to be that way too, is, when you hear a certain song, it will sort of transport you back into a moment in your life. And sometimes films can have that effect too, where, I rewatched the film tonight, and it's just so strange to think of myself watching this film 10 years apart. I mean, I may have watched it in the interceding years, I don't know. I can't particularly remember if I did see it before now, if I did watch it again. But it's so strange to think that 10 years have gone by, and in that 10 years so much has happened, and there's been more loss. I mean, 2007 was the year that I lost my grandmother too, so I can't believe I didn't think of that. It was a time of great loss for me, and then a few years later my uncle died. So it's those 10 years of, a lot has happened, a lot, a few good things, but it's mainly been a lot of pain and a lot of loss, and it's like it hasn't stopped. I feel like I went through things as a teenager. Within 3 years I went to 3 funerals. I went to my father's, I went to my grandmother's, and I went to my uncle's, and that was by the time I was 20 years old. So it's just, a lot happened within a certain span of time, and it absolutely sort of debilitated me in many ways. The pain and the fear and all of that, and so you just think of everything that's happened in those 10 years between watching this film and then watching it again, and it's just sort of shocking, I think. But I think that's why I have more of an emotional reaction to this film, is because it is tied to those moments in my life and a certain time in my life. And so it's fascinating that Schnabel even attempted this film, because how do you make a film about someone trapped in their body? There's not a lot of action in the film. There's not a lot that happens. You're trying to convey a very internal struggle of a man who cannot move, he cannot speak, he all these things that films depend upon which is movement and sound and how people react to one another and interact. None of that is available to you. So you have to be quite creative in how you tell this story. And Schnabel was able to do that. I mean, I don't love his personality as a person, Julian Schnabel. I don't know a ton about him, but I do think that he did a really good job with this film, and he was quite innovative and quite creative with the way that he told the story. So, as the film begins, Schnabel begins with the perspective of Bauby, and from the perspective inside Bauby's consciousness, and we are really seeing through Bauby's one functioning eyelid, and we see how his entire world has been shrunk down to this one space, this one view through his eye. It's blurry, it's out of focus, it melts in and out of clarity, just as Bauby's consciousness would as he's coming out of a coma. And from what I understand, Schnabel devised some kind of thing to make it look like that. There's even blinks. There's even what you think of as blinks from an eye. He's trying to make you believe that you are in the vantage point of Bauby and seeing through that one eye. And so there's even blinking. There's, when he closes his eyes, you can see the light stream in through the skin, and that redness that you'll get, that red color that you'll see when light is streaming through your eyelids. So there's the blurriness, and so it feels very accurate. I mean, you really do feel like you're inside Bauby's consciousness. And that's what Schnabel wants to do. He wants to immerse us in that consciousness and make us see or make us feel what it's like for Bauby to wake up in this new world, to wake up to this discovery that he can't speak, he can't move, he can't walk, he can't communicate. He's completely paralyzed, and yet he has all his mental faculties. He can think inside his head. He can make jokes. He can talk. He can think. He can't talk. In his head, he can. He can remember. He can imagine. So he still has all his mental faculties, but he is cut off, and he is completely locked in. And there's definitely a claustrophobia about it, as we do see the world through that soul eyelid that periodically blinks. And I got to thinking this really is a very vivid and maybe even extreme way to create empathy and identification, to put us in the mind and body of another person who's going through an extreme experience. We always say, put yourself in somebody else's shoes. In this instance, Schnabel is trying to put us into somebody else's, eye. It's very intense. It's very intense. And yet there's something very, beautiful and poetic about it, too, with that blurriness. And it almost comes off a little bit dreamy at times. Schnabel, unlike Beineix, is able to use art and fiction to take us into Bauby's life. He takes us where Beineix cannot take us with his documentary. Because of the limits of the documentary form, Beineix can only remain outside of Bauby's consciousness. He films the corridors, the sea. He films Bauby being taken care of and blinking with Claude, but he can't venture much farther than that. Whereas with fiction and with feature filmmaking, Schnabel is able to go deeper, I think. And I got to thinking about how I wonder if this film resonated with me, because from an early age, probably around like 13, my dad got sick, and my dad struggled with a lot of health problems in the last few years of his life. Even though he was young, he was only 45 when he passed away. But from a very early age, because of seeing my father struggle with his health and go through health issues, it made me very sensitive, I think, to the precariousness of our bodies, to the vulnerabilities of our bodies, to the ways in which our bodies can malfunction, can break down, can just stop working the way that we want them to work. And I think that's definitely a theme in this film, and it's something that I think that makes the viewer reflect on, that it's something that it could happen to any of us. Bauby is driving his car and he has a stroke. There's no explanation for why he has this stroke. The doctors can't tell him why locked-in syndrome happened to him. It's a mysterious condition that doctors don't fully understand. Every day, people have things like this happen to them. Aneurysms, very sudden, catastrophic things that nobody can predict, nobody can see coming. And it's scary how vulnerable our bodies are, how we have no defense against these things, and how out of control we are, really, when it comes to our health and when it comes to our bodies. And that is a subject that I think a lot of people fear. A lot of people don't want to talk about mortality. They don't want to talk about vulnerability. They don't want to talk about how we are all susceptible to ill health. Everybody wants to think they're going to be able-bodied forever, but most of us are going to experience health issues over the course of our lives. No matter what we do, you can do everything right. You can run every day and eat the right foods and not smoke and not drink and stay away from all the bad stuff, and bad things can still happen to you. And it's random, and it doesn't always make sense, and it's terrifying. And so you see Bauby is thrown into this situation that he has no control over, and it's so sudden, and he can't make sense of it. But he still is trying to communicate through it with his eyelid. And you definitely see that need to communicate. I mean, he certainly didn't have to write his memoir. He didn't have to blink his eyelid. He could have definitely not done that. But as a writer, as someone who worked for a magazine, he obviously felt compelled to say something, to write, to communicate. Of course, that doesn't necessarily change what he's going through. His body is still paralyzed, even though he uses his imagination. And a diving bell, some people may not know what it is. I didn't know what it was when I first saw the film and read the memoir. But a diving bell is like this suit of metal that people used to wear to go to the bottom of the ocean. It's this you've probably seen them without knowing what they're called, but it's like this big metal suit that people wore so that they could go to like the bottom of the ocean. And so the locked-in syndrome makes him feel like he's in the diving bell. But the butterfly is his imagination and his ability to think about things that transport him. He'll think about places that he's traveled or places that he's read about in books. He'll think about really great meals that he once had. He'll think about his different memories, and that allows him to continue living. So through his imagination, he becomes the butterfly, and he becomes able to escape, I guess, sort of the pain sometimes. But unfortunately, even with imagination, it doesn't change it. He still has to endure it. And his memoir, to me, has always felt sort of like this secret document that was sort of smuggled out of some infernal place. Like, it makes me think about the prisoners who escaped the Nazi death camps, and they tried to warn the world about what was happening. And they would write down messages, and they would try to let the rest of the world know what was going on in these camps. And in this way, I think that Bauby's memoir is like this secret document, this thing, these words that he's able to smuggle out of his body and out of his situation. And I think maybe Bauby's trying to warn all of us that life is fleeting and painfully unpredictable. A man full of life and vigor is reduced to just being in a hospital bed, and blinking one eye to send this sort of last message before his impending death. So this is a very sort of vital story, I think, and if it doesn't move you, I don't know what will. I mean, even if maybe you don't like the film, because everybody has their different opinions, but the memoir itself is really moving, and it's quite an accomplishment that he was able to write it at all. And if you think of all the different art forms out there, only writing can do that. Someone who's trapped in their body and can only communicate with their eyelid can't do a film. They can't paint a picture. They can't record a song. I mean, of all the art forms, writing lends itself to that sort of predicament, where he can't express himself in any other way except language. And I think that's very powerful, and I'm always very interested in like the power of language in people's lives, and how language can become a form of salvation. And you think of, like, for instance, the Holocaust memoirs that people wrote. They wrote those because they needed to express what had happened to them. They needed to warn the world. They had something to say. And I think in a similar way with Bauby's predicament, it's unique and it's painful. I mean, he finds a way to cope with it and to get through it, but it's very difficult. It's very difficult to be paralyzed. It's very difficult. I mean, and in spite of those things, he's still able to write and create something. And I think that's pretty extraordinary. And I think that can really be a reminder to us about the power of language, the power of writing. And you may not have locked-in syndrome, but you may be going through a difficult time in your life, or you may be going through a really hard experience. But writing could be something that's very therapeutic and something very healing in a way for some people. And some people do use it for that. And there's a reason, because language is something that's easily accessible. You don't need any kind of special tools. You just need a pen and paper. And it can be very helpful, and thankfully Bauby was able to write this memoir and to really share his story. I'm looking at my notes, seeing what else I want to say. This is a powerful film about nostalgia and memory. There are flashbacks in the film. Some of the film we are inside Bauby's eye, I guess you could say. And then other times it's a more conventional film where you will see Bauby like at a photo shoot, or you'll see him with his children, or you'll see him shaving his father. There's a really poignant scene that I'll talk about where he's shaving his father, and you'll see him on a trip to Lourdes with his girlfriend that he took a few years prior. So you're not in his body the whole time. There are times when you see him as you would regularly see an actor in a film. But it's really about memory, and how his memories are what sustain him through the pain of the present moment. And in his memoir, which I reread tonight as well, because it's very short, probably took me an hour to maybe an hour and a half or 2 hours. It's a very short memoir. And he talks about remembering taking a bath. And he writes, "Rarely do I feel my condition so cruelly as when I am recalling such pleasures." So at the same time, even though remembering can be a comfort, and it can be something that brings him joy, it can also bring a lot of pain, because you compare and contrast what you had in the past and what you have in the present. And memories can be very painful, and they can really activate a certain depth of sadness, I think, because you think about what you've lost, you think about what you no longer have, and even though remembering it is comforting because you did have it at one time, it just sort of amplifies the difficulty of your present situation. I think Schnabel brings a very unique visual language to a unique story, and as I said, he was daring to make the film this way, to try to go into Bauby's consciousness, and even, set up the blinking, and it feels very realistic, as I said earlier. And I wondered myself if maybe him coming from a painting background, and him being a painter, possibly gave him that audacity, that he doesn't necessarily identify solely as a filmmaker. He's someone who's outside filmmaking a bit. He's a bit of an outsider, I would say. And so I wonder if that gave him a more creative approach to the subject matter. And I wonder if maybe another director would have tried to film it in a more conventional manner, whereas I felt like Schnabel was trying to sort of push the form and push the technology in order to tell the story in a more creative way. So I think if anything, the film does have a creative and innovative aspect to it because of the point of view that Schnabel takes. Now, I have not seen a film do that. I haven't seen every film that's ever been made, so there could be a film out there that's already done that, but I did think it was a creative way to approach the subject. I mean, for me, a film like this, it really goes beyond critical reviews or other people's opinions. I mean, I don't know how other people see this film. I don't know if it affects them the same way that it affects me, but all I can say is that it did have an impact on me. A powerful aspect of the film is really this bifurcation that takes place, and how Schnabel is able to represent this separation between who Bauby is inside, his memories, his jokes, the things he thinks in his head, and how he is seen from the outside. Basically, this man lying motionless in a hospital bed, blinking one eye. How do you reconcile those two things? And there's a point at which Bauby sees his reflection in like a plate of glass, and he's just shocked. He's like, is that me? And there's this disconnect between who he is inside and who he is outside. And yeah, I think that's sort of a bifurcation that happens for all of us, that we all have our own consciousness and our own subjectivity and our own point of view, and we are this certain person inside our skin, inside our own brains and our own minds. And then there's who we are as people see us from the outside. And you can never get inside another person's world, another person's mind. And I think part of art's function is that it's trying to translate that inner world and that inner life to other people. For me it is. When I'm writing, when I'm creating something, I'm trying to transmit this inner world that I have and what's inside of me. I'm trying to transport some of that outside of me to share with other people. And so this film is so graphically shows that disconnection between what's inside and what's outside, how we view the world and experience the world, and how the world sees us and views us, and how sometimes those two things often do not connect, do not reflect each other properly, and are often very different. There are discrepancies between Bauby's real life and the film. Of course, I did say earlier that the film uses fiction to show certain truths. It uses fiction, I think, to tell a larger story. So what are we to make of these discrepancies? The biggest one is the way in which Bauby's girlfriend is portrayed. And this is dishonest in many ways. And it's a bone of contention for Bauby's own friends. If you've seen the film, then you know that there is a blonde woman played by Emmanuelle Seigner. I think that's how you pronounce it. And she plays a woman named Celine. And she is the mother of Bauby's children. He did have a woman that he had his 2 children with. I can't remember her real name. It's not Celine. I don't think it's Celine. They were never married, though, and they were not together when he had his stroke. At the time he had his stroke, he was with a woman named Florence. And Florence is represented by a character in the film named Inez. And Inez doesn't visit him in the hospital. She's not able to. She calls on the phone. So what the film does is that it pretends like the mother of Bauby's children was the primary caretaker and was the primary support in Bauby's life. This is not true. The mother of his children was not really part of his life when he was in the hospital, and she wasn't there when he died. Who was there was his girlfriend Florence, played a character named Inez in the film. Florence was there every day. She was by his side. She was there when he died, I believe. And yet the film, for some reason, nobody knows, portrays her as though she was not there and she was unable to come and see him in the hospital. So this portrayal of Florence so upset Bauby's friends at Elle Magazine in France that they would not screen the film and they would not review it. So all of this story is told in an article in The Guardian, which I will put in the description. It's really unclear why Schnabel did this. Nobody knows. I don't see... the only thing I can think of, maybe, is that it's easier for it to be the mother of his children, because then you can have the scenes with the children if that makes sense. So if you make her the main caregiver, then she can come with the kids, and then there's scenes of him being with his children. That's all I can think. I don't know. But it's, once again, it's a film based on Bauby. There's a lot of factual stuff in there, but then there's some things that are not so factual, and you never know with why writers or filmmakers take these creative licenses. I'm not sure, but I just wanted to make you aware of the controversy, because there are people who were upset about it. There were people that knew Bauby and did not like the way his girlfriend Florence was portrayed, because she was there every day and she did love him and she did care about him, whereas the mother of his children was not there very often and didn't act as that support system at all, whereas she did. She would drive like several hours, several times a week to go and see him and to be with him. So I did feel at times that the film, that women in the film were very sexualized, and they seemed to only be there as props, as something beautiful to look at. You know, all the therapists that work with Bauby are very beautiful, and some of the flashbacks are him with like previous girlfriends and things like that. And so women are sort of reduced to their sexuality and their sexual attractiveness. And I mean, that is a part of the film. I don't particularly like that aspect of the film, but it's there. I mean, I don't think you can really deny it, that the women are kind of there for their sexual attractiveness. And I mean, Claude, who helps him with the letters and with transcribing, maybe there's a deeper connection there, and she's not quite as sexualized. But I did feel like several of the women kind of were. I mean, should this matter when you're evaluating the film as a work of art? I mean, I think the portrayal of women's important, but when it comes to the measure to which the girlfriend is included in the film, I mean, I don't know if that affects other people. I thought it was an interesting story, and I thought it was an interesting aspect of the film, because I wasn't aware of it at all, so I didn't know. I mean, I leave you to decide that for yourself. I mean, it bothers me a little bit. I don't totally understand it, but I mean, it is part of the film. But I mean, I still think the film is very powerful, and it definitely has a beauty and an intensity about it. And every film is going to have its flaws. So, and I think the final aspect of the film that I would like to talk about is sort of Schnabel's stated reason for making the film. There's a really interesting moment, and the whole interview is very interesting, that Schnabel did with Charlie Rose in 2007 while he was promoting the film. And I would say that it's an interview that's really stayed with me for, I guess, like a decade now. And so this is the exchange. So this is what Schnabel says. He said, "I'm not scared to die anymore. And one of the reasons why I made this film is because my father, who was 92, was terrified of death. And he was stuck inside of his body. And so the idea is not to be stuck inside of your body." And Charlie Rose says, "But so how did making the movie get you eliminate your fear of death?" Julian Schnabel, "By making the present more satisfying. And I think what happens when people go see the movie, people come, yeah, I went out of the movie, I grabbed my kids, I hugged my children, or I did this." And Charlie Rose says, "Things are precious." And so Schnabel directly says, "I made this film because my father was terrified of death and he was stuck inside of his body." And that always stayed with me, that he really made the film because his father was scared of death. And so I think he wanted to directly confront the subject of death so that he himself would not fear death as much as his father did. And so seeing that interview, and it could have even been that interview that got me to see the film, I'm not totally sure. I mean, I'm sure I probably saw that interview before the film came to the theater where I lived. So I'm pretty sure that probably got me interested in it. So I saw that interview, a year after my own father's death. And so it was something that always stayed with me, that he made the film out of this desire to reconcile his fear of death, or to diminish that fear in some way. And that's what the film is about. The film is about life. It's about living. It's about appreciating life. It's about affirming life. And I think that's why it is so moving for people. It's about these small little moments. When the film opens and you're from Bauby's perspective, you see like roses on a table. You see the curtain blowing in the wind. And then when you watch the rest of the film, it's really punctuated with just these small moments of beauty, whether it's Bauby in his wheelchair looking at the sea and at the waves crashing, or when he's thinking about a trip that he took with his girlfriend to Lourdes, the holy place in France, and there's a shot of her hair blowing in the wind, or his children playing on the beach. It's really a film about someone who, in a second, lost almost everything. He doesn't get to eat. He has like a feeding tube. He doesn't get to move. He doesn't get to do anything. And so when he loses all of that, that is when he finally sees how precious all those things were. And so when he goes back in his memories, he thinks of eating, of just something small like that we do every day. We eat. Or when he's looking at the window, the light streaming in the window, or he's thinking of his girlfriend's hair blowing in the wind, or he's watching his child play on the beach. These are small moments, but life is made of them. Life is made of these small, ordinary moments that we don't always notice and we don't always appreciate until we don't have them anymore, until something happens and we lose them, or we're unable to experience them. And I think when you go through a health scare, or you go through health issues, I myself deal with chronic pain. My health, for 10 years now, my health has just been horrible. And all the time I think about when I was younger. I think about when I was 10, 11, 12, before my dad got sick, before my dad died, before my own health started to deteriorate. I think of those things. I think of when I was able to just do what I wanted, and my body would let me do basic things. My body would let me do the things that I wanted to do, and it wasn't such a struggle to live. It wasn't so exhausting. It wasn't so painful to be alive. I think of those times in my life because they are comforting, but as for Bauby, they're also very painful because they remind me of what I no longer have and what I may never have again. So this film is one that when you walk out of the theater, when you turn the computer off, if you watch it on Netflix on your laptop, it makes you look at life differently. It makes you appreciate, the light streaming through the trees, birds chirping in the morning, the dew on the grass, these small little things that maybe you never noticed, or you forgot to notice, or you just were never able to properly appreciate. it makes you think about how everything can be gone in a second. Everything can change. And that's terrifying. And you have no control over it. Just like Bauby didn't have any control over it. So what do you do? I mean, the only thing you can do is to just do your best. To just do the best you can. And, you know, it's very moving and very poignant when Bauby talks about the last time he saw his father. His father's like 92 years old, and his father's still alive when Bauby has this stroke. And he just thinks about shaving him. He shaved his father. You know, he lathered the cream and he put it on his father's face, and he shaved him. And in the film, Bauby's father is played by the legendary Max von Sydow, who is known for his films with Ingmar Bergman and also other directors. And it's such a moving scene. That's what Bauby remembers. He just remembers shaving his father. It was an ordinary day, and yet that was the last time he saw his father. And he can't see his father because his father is 92 years old and lives like on the 4th floor of an apartment, and he's not in great health. And so one day his father calls Bauby at the hospital, and he talks about how both of them are trapped. That he is trapped in his apartment because of his ill health and his age, and Bauby is trapped in his body because of the locked-in syndrome and the stroke. And so it's something that sort of connects these two men, and it reminds us that all of us, or many of us sometimes, are locked in different ways. That you might be locked into your apartment for a reason, or you might feel locked inside your body or trapped in your body. There's a full range of human experience, you know, and some of us do feel trapped, and it's a very moving scene. And Max von Sydow does a really great job. He doesn't even have that big of a role in the film, but it's very moving, and it's very poignant, and it's yet another reminder of the body's deterioration, of how vulnerable we are, and how your health is not promised. It's not something that's promised, and when you are in good health, it's something that you tend to take for granted, and you don't realize that you've taken it for granted until you don't have it anymore, until your health is bad and you are struggling, and it's a very difficult experience to live with. It really is. And so, but you just do your best, just like Bauby did. You know, Bauby did his best to survive, and he wrote his memoir, and but he did die in 1997, and but I mean, he left behind a document, and he left behind his story that continues to be shared through Schnabel's film, and through Beineix's film, and through the memoir, and his story continues, and it's had a profound impact on me. And so especially The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, that film had a huge impact on my life. You know, I experienced it when I was 17 or 18 years old, and you know, a decade later, it still has sort of a hold on me, and Bauby is someone that I just come back to, because I think his story is so extraordinary. So I think I've definitely said everything I want to say about these two films and the memoir, and of course I recommend all of it if you're interested in the story. And it's certainly, especially The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, I mean, both the book and the Julian Schnabel film, they are life affirmative, you know, life affirming, and I think they will make you more grateful and more appreciative of what you have, and of the small moments in life that can hold great beauty. So I think that's where I will stop. So I thank you for listening, and until next time, keep watching films, and I will try to get another episode out when I can. But I really do appreciate you listening, and I do appreciate your support. So thank you very much. Bye for now.